Hello. Hello. Hello.
Oh, okay, super. suicide. So then I was kind of reflecting myself on, what does that mean in my world, in Judaism? And Jack and I got talking about this, and we decided to share kind of a little bit about this process and about the Jewish teachings about death and helping ourselves die at the end of life. So just to kind of set the stage, Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Is this better? Oh, yeah, I can hear me now. Okay. So once person contacts us, whether it's through our website or through a phone call or if it's a referral from one of the hospice nurses, we basically come to your house, which is what we do. That is our practice. So for all our visits, whether it's primary care, urgent care, and end-of-life care, all of our visits are in our patients' homes. So we will come, we will sit down, and the first thing I do is I try to find out those two decision points. One is does that person have a terminal diagnosis? And two, does that person have capacity? Are they understanding what their medical condition is and what they are, what we're talking about? And it's not, some situation where the wife's trying to get rid of the husband or something like that. And then the third part is, are they able to self-administer the medication? And have they been eating, or have they not been eating? And if they can't eat, are we able to use their rectum to administer the medication? We sign some paperwork. That's pretty much these days for everything, thanks to our lawyer colleagues. And then we set a date. For some folks, we might say, well, I just want to know this is available as an option. And for some patients, they are very determined, and usually they'll say, I want to do this yesterday. New Mexico law does require a 48-hour waiting period, but the very cool thing is that actually if I feel the patient is not going to survive those 48 hours, I actually can waive that requirement. One of the biggest challenges for us is getting the medications. There's only 2 pharmacies in the state, and they're both in Albuquerque. So if this is a Friday afternoon, we are probably not going to be able to do the ingestion until Monday afternoon because we have to get the medications from Albuquerque. And they are compounded by these 2 pharmacies. So it's not something you walk into Walgreens and order. We have them delivered to the patient's room. They come in a lockbox. So nobody but me and the pharmacist actually know the code to these medications because, yes, it is a lethal cocktail. On the day of the assigned date that, again, the patient chooses, and I show up, I confirm again that they have capacity. I make sure that they, in the meantime, haven't gotten more confused. I have patients I follow for 2 or 3 months before they might decide to ingest, and a lot of things change. Their cancer has progressed. They might have, they're on more medications, they're more confused. So part of my job on that day is to really assess, are they still able to make this decision, understand what we're talking about. I've had one case, interestingly enough, of a patient who was a rectal administration. Prior to the administration of the medications, the hospice nurse will arrive and do an enema. And by the time I arrived an hour later, he thought he died. You don't qualify if you think you're dead. So, and luckily, interestingly enough, his daughter was a physician, and she was like, "Yeah, I agree." We like, "No, you're still here. We're all around." It's a very interesting situation. That was the only time I've had somebody who didn't qualify on the day of. So yes, that is going to be part of the requirement for the law. What I will typically do after that, once I've kind of determined, I'll walk into the kitchen, and I joke at that point, I'm really just the bartender. I mix the cocktail. I give the family some time to be with their loved one, and on their signal, I walk back in. I hand them a glass of this milky-looking material. It apparently tastes terrible. I have to admit, I've never tasted it. That's why I'm still sitting here. And the person then will usually go to sleep within about 2 to 3 minutes, and they will never wake up again. But they're not dead. The average time to death is about 45 minutes, but I've had my longest time to death was about 4 hours, and the longest on record is about 19 hours. So the good news is the patient will never wake up again, but we are sitting there with them. Part of our service is we're there with the family throughout the process. And it's very gentle. Basically the person goes to sleep, and it is, again, as I contrast it to my experiences on the COVID unit at the hospital, very, very different. Families around. I've had situations where it was just the husband and wife who were there. and I've had situations where there was a full-on party and a band playing and a buffet and a real celebration of life. So, and that kind of leads me to really kind of, I think one of the really amazing things about this is it really, especially for people who have nearing the end of life and have really lost a lot of control. And I see this especially with my oncology, my cancer patients who have been on this journey of getting this treatments and just spending, days on and days out, radiation and chemotherapy and surgeries, et cetera. And they just haven't felt well for a very, very long time. And what they all say is, I've just lost control. I have no more control over my life. This is kind of your last gesture of control. And I add to that, it's like, not only are you taking control, you are going to kill your cancer. So you're taking full charge of killing. So there's some really powerful, philosophical things about this process as we let our patients pursue this final treatment. So I think that in a nutshell kind of covers kind of how this all works. And so the real question I have for the rabbi is this something that, as a Jew, can I pursue this treatment?
I think that's a good pause point. This is not an easy subject for us to be discussing. You may want to stretch a little bit, I don't know. We had kind of planned like 20 minutes for Dr. Rosen and 20 minutes for myself, and then ample time for questions after. So if you're okay, we'll keep going before you start asking questions on the physician side. Is that okay with people? So this is a difficult subject, and I'm both a physicist and a rabbi, so last night I went to ChatGPT to see if I could find a joke about a rabbi, a physicist, and a doctor, and ChatGPT does not have a good sense of humor. So it created some jokes, but frankly, I didn't think they were funny. I'm going to prefer not to use a microphone and speak loudly because I have some papers and books that I want to be doing.
It's just there's an echo. There's an echo without the microphone.
There's an echo without the microphone.
The sound.
Maybe people could move closer. There's no reason to be.
All right, we'll give it a try with the microphone. Okay, so, no, that's okay. No. That's okay. So anyway, so I modified an existing joke to start out, and I hope you'll bear with that. So a rabbi, a physician, and a physicist are playing golf, and they get stuck behind a really slow group of golfers, and they complain to the manager of the course. You know this, but I just wanted to start with it anyway. They complain to the manager of the course. The manager says, they're a bunch of firemen who lost their vision when they tried to save some people in a fire, so we let them play for free, but they're quite slow. And the rabbi said, please, could you give me their Hebrew names? I want to say a Mishaberach on their behalf. The physician says, I know about some ophthalmological treatments that have improved sight in people. And the physicist says, why can't they play at night? So that's much better than what ChatGPT came up with, by the way. So let me just say, my guess is that I'm going to be representing a minority perspective here for the bulk of what I share with you, because most of you, I'm guessing, are on board with this concept of medical assistance in dying, and largely Jewish tradition is not on board with it. So you just need to understand that I worked hard to find some areas of common ground, and when Joel and I first discussed this, I shared with him a story from the Talmud that I'm going to share with you up front here, which is, I would say, somewhat supportive of this concept, but the bulk of the rabbinic literature over the millennia, and it really is millennia, is fairly negative on this topic. And the reason is that life is held as such a special thing in Jewish tradition that ending life seems counter to that. So that's kind of the punchline, and yet and let me just say, and yet, things have changed over thousands of years, and I'm going to close my section with a rabbinic responsum. Responsa are when somebody poses a question to either a rabbinic authority or a rabbinic body, and they write an answer back. That's called a responsum, and these are published. And I found a responsum from 1 year ago from the Reform movement that is actually quite supportive of this. And I'm going to close with that, but I just wanted to share with you the bulk of the texts that I came across would not be particularly supportive. So let me start with this Talmudic section that was one story that I had shared with Joel. Joel and I have known each other for a number of years, and this topic came up, and I shared this story with him early on. It's kind of a minority perspective, however. So this is dealing with a rabbi who's known as Rebbe because he's like a really big guy, right? So very important. He is the one who edited the Mishnah. The Mishnah is kind of the core text of the oral tradition that follows the written Bible. So he did this probably about 1,800 years ago. That tells you something about when he lived. And this story comes out of the Talmud, and it says, on the day that Rebbe was dying, his colleagues, the rabbis, because of his illness, decreed a public fast and begged for heavenly mercy. And they said, whoever shall say that Rebbe has died shall be pierced with a sword. So they're pretty negative about anybody trying to hasten this process. Now, Rebbe had a maidservant who had been by his side for many, many years and was quite familiar with him and his practices. The maidservant of Rebbe ascended to the roof and said, those above, meaning heaven, seek to take Rebbe, and those below, meaning his colleagues, seek to keep Rebbe. So she saw that tension. And she said, may it be God's will that those below overcome those above. But then she saw how Rebbe was suffering, and he was in great pain and experiencing great difficulty, and it was gastrointestinal. Without going into details of what the Talmud says, he had very serious gastrointestinal issues. And she saw how difficult it was for him to be suffering like this. And then she changed her tune and she says, may it be God's will that those above overcome those below. But the rabbis, his colleagues, did not cease in their praying for mercy. So she took a small earthenware vessel and threw it from the roof to the ground. And when the rabbis heard the sound of the breaking vessel, they ceased momentarily to pray for mercy. And at that moment, Rebbe died. That's not the end of the story, but it gives you the flavor of this, and thank you. And clearly you can see that what she's doing is, in some ancient sense, an analog of medical assistance in dying. But what's important is that she's actually viewed as a righteous heroine, if you will, from that period. That's what's important, that she's not vilified, she's not, it's not like curse her name or anything like that. So this story is actually, I would say, favorable about her actions. Her actions are indirect, right? She just disturbed their prayer, and that resulted in his death, but she didn't do something active, if you will. And that's probably an important point. As we get into the much more modern texts, they know this story. The rabbis are familiar with this story. And so those who are going to be on the opposing side, if you will, are going to narrow down the applicability of that story. But I just wanted to start with that because that was a story that I shared with Joel early on. I also want to share with you a responsum. This is not an ancient responsum, but it's not a modern responsum either. This came from probably the early part of the 19th century. And a question was posed to a rabbi, a scholar, who was the rabbi in Smyrna, which I think is Greece. Is that correct? Somebody, or Turkey? Is it Turkey? Okay. So he was the highly respected legal authority among some community. So he wrote a responsum. Now, and I don't know who's Jewish and who's not Jewish and who's familiar with all this, but it's not like there's a chief rabbi of the world and you just ask the question and you get the answer, right? So there are lots of responsa out there, and those who subscribe to what he has to say then, will say this is a useful responsum, and if you don't like what he has to say, you don't. That's actually quite important. Something that I read, actually I'm going to hold off on that just for a moment. Something that I read in the course of preparing for this said that only a laborious and aimless detour through knowable Judaism gives us the certainty that the ultimate leap leads to Jewish teachings. Our search must therefore be aimless. The point of that is there's so much literature out there in Jewish tradition that you can find something that supports anything you want on any side of any issue. I don't care what the issue is. If you're looking hard enough, you will find something that supports it. And I thought that was an interesting quote, because unless you approach this with an open mind and the chips will fall where they will, you're going to find something that supports you, but I don't know that that's an appropriate way to treat Jewish text. So I just wanted to share that with you. So this responsum is one that I found, and the question that was posed to the rabbi was, this person has a pious wife, and she's been sick with a long, enduring sickness for more than 20 years. She's plagued and crushed with pain. Again, he probably wrote this in the early part of the 19th century. And the question goes on, but what's really posed to this rabbi is, because of her great pain, the woman is praying to God that God take her life so that she can rest from her suffering. And the question is, her husband and her sons don't want to pray for her death. Are they allowed to? And his responsum, which goes through a lot of different source materials, including this Talmudic story that I shared with you, his responsum concludes that it is okay to pray for her death. And this was included in a collection of responsa, so it's not an, yes, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of responsa out there, but this one, was chosen because it has some value to us today. So I think that was useful to share with you. I'm going to shift gears to the negative side, if you will, or the con, maybe is a better way to say that. And this is kind of standard Jewish thinking along these lines, at least historically. So this work is a slightly post-Talmudic work, so probably from about 1,400 years ago. And it says, a dying man is considered the same as a living man in every respect. And that means legally. So I hear there are lawyers here. So yes, so legally they have all the same responsibilities and privileges of any other person. Just being a person who is dying does not change that. I mean, in some sense, we're all dying, but I think here they're talking about somebody who is close to death. It says he may inherit property, he may bequeath property, and all of this, and it's got a list of other things, applies until the moment he dies. So he's treated as a living person until he's no longer living. There's no sort of in-between, if you will, from a legal point of view. But it goes on, and it says, he may not be stirred, nor may he be washed. So you can't jostle this person. And this is now a person who's in this last stage of life. It's clear this person is dying, and I think it's called a goses. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I think that's often associated with there's like the rattle in the throat that you would get of somebody who is dying. So a goses is considered a living person and has all these legal responsibilities just like everybody else, but it does say he may not be stirred nor may he be washed. He should not be laid upon sand or salt until the moment he dies. And I'll just go on slightly longer and then I'll share with you what this is all about. His eyes may not be closed. Whosoever touches him or stirs him sheds blood. So they're not very keen on the person who does that. And why is that? Because by disturbing him in this way, you're hastening the process by which he will ultimately die. And so you're really not supposed to do that. This is a post-Talmudic work, but it's a somewhat authoritative post-Talmudic work. These thoughts are captured in codes of Jewish law. I'm not going to share that with you because it's fairly repetitious, but this happens to be a section from maybe the most familiar code of Jewish law known as the Shulchan Aruch, which is probably the most widely cited code of Jewish law, which means that they took the Talmud and extracted just the answers, if you will, which violates the whole idea of the Talmud. The Talmud is supposed to be sharing with you the fact that there are different points of view and debates that take place. But codes of Jewish law became popular. This particular code of Jewish law became popular for the wrong reason, in my opinion. I'm being a little bit on the podium here, I suppose, because it came out just when printing came out. So that tells you this is, some 500 years old or so, but most importantly, it could be disseminated widely, whereas previous codes of Jewish law couldn't be so easily disseminated because you had to copy them by hand. So that basically shares those same sentiments. And I could go on and on about this, but usually it's talking about the importance of life in Jewish tradition, etc., etc. Let me segue because I want to make sure that we have time for discussion and questions. So there's a lot of additional materials because things evolve with time. Medical practice evolves with time. People in the old days, maybe I'll cut to the chase. By the way, I brought these materials so that you could look at them as well. It's not just because they don't fit on my bookshelves. But I brought this book, which is one that I bought in conjunction with preparing for this, called Jewish Ethics and the Care of End-of-Life Patients. And it has some excellent essays in it. It's a collection of essays. And this is from, I think I said 2006 or something, but it's really looking at what was the situation in Switzerland, because that's where this practice existed at the time that this was put together. One essay in here points out that it is a little bit of a cheat to say that we value life as an infinite value, because even in the written Bible, it talks about capital punishment and it talks about war. So the guy points out in this essay, what do you mean that all life is infinitely valuable if you see these? It's like some life is infinitely valuable, or most situations, or, he tries to shade it by showing quite clearly, I think, that there are exceptions to that. So that was a useful thing to look at. But having looked at all of these things, I will share with you that typically in Judaism, the more liberal movements are ahead of the game and others come along later. So I looked, starting with the conservative movement, and with a rabbi who I respect very highly, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is an expert on matters of life and death, which is the title of this book. And it's not very supportive of the idea of physician assistance in death. The Reform movement, which is even more liberal if you want to be grossly categorizing these things, the Reform movement has a collection of responsa called Teshuvot for the 90s. So this is the 1990s. And I cite in here a responsum from a collection of rabbis who sort of act as the authority for the Reform movement. And it's pretty negative also. This is Teshuvot for the 90s. But I'm going to close my section by sharing with you a responsum from 5782. So those of you who have your Jewish calendar handy, you know that it is right now 5783. So this is a responsum that is numbered 5782.1. So this is the first responsum from the Reform authority, Reform body of rabbinic figures. And the topic is medical assistance in dying. And, you know, you can Google and find this. I don't know that it's published in hard copy anywhere, but you can Google and find this. And I just want to share with you some points from this that I thought were quite interesting, because they do come out in support of medical assistance in dying. Now, they were examining the Canadian law, because that was what was posed to them, that was what was familiar to them, if you will. So there are probably some important distinctions between Canadian law and New Mexico law that somebody else can speak to. But they were really talking about Canadian law. And they said that there were three things that had changed. And it's these changes that they use to come out in support of medical assistance in dying. The first one is that that there's an understanding of total pain that didn't exist at the time that most of these materials were written. There's more than just physical pain. There are other aspects to pain, and I think there are probably experts here, including Dr. Rosen, who can speak to that. But that was one of the points that they take into consideration, that the understanding of the concept of total pain is a difference. The second thing is that when these texts were written, when the Talmud was written, when all these texts were written, very few people lived long enough to die of the various diseases that accompany aging in a prosperous society. They didn't die of heart disease. They didn't die of strokes. They didn't die of cancer. They didn't die of diabetes. These were not diseases that people died from. Parkinson's is also listed as an example. So modern medical treatments have prolonged life, but they've now opened up a whole bunch of other paths to death, if you will, that were not relevant to the writers of these earlier texts. So that was the second point. And the third point has to do with context, and it's kind of a weaker point, so I don't want to go into that. But I just want to say that their conclusion in this particular responsum is unambiguously supportive of medical assistance in dying as applied to the Canadian law, if I can put that caveat on there, because that's what they were addressing. It says a Jew, so they're very clear who they're applying their ruling to, a Jew suffering from a terminal illness whose death is reasonably foreseeable may avail themselves of medical assistance in dying. A Jew suffering from a chronic illness whose death is not reasonably foreseeable may also choose to avail themselves of medical assistance in dying as a last resort if living with the degree of suffering they must endure is intolerable. And this is important because without doctors, much of this doesn't take place. A Jewish physician who recognizes that a suffering individual has a terminal or incurable condition that has placed them in a state of total pain may respond to the sufferer's desire to end their suffering by administering or making available drugs that will terminate the individual's life. That's pretty clearly where we are in this state right now. So that took me some years to answer your question, Joel, because I think you posed it to me a while ago when I shared that story about Rebbe's maid. But I just wanted you to know this is not a black and white topic in the Jewish texts. And I worked hard to find some balance, but if you're not broad enough in your search, you will go to old texts, and old texts are pretty uniformly against this. So I think that's the end of what I wanted to share with you.
I have a question. So the conclusion you came from that most recent writing, to me, when I heard what you were saying, it was very connected to pain. And I don't think that the law in New Mexico, I mean, says you have to be in pain, right? It says it has to be chronic, and it says that you have to be certain to die within 6 months, but it doesn't have that connection to actual physical pain. We can assume that 99% of the time that coexists. But I guess I'm asking Dr. Rosa and you, what if there is that suffering without the pain? I mean, maybe it's a nonsensical question because someone might not seek to end their life in that situation if they're not suffering. But is that, to you, Joel, a prerequisite to see that there is suffering that they've expressed is really diminishing their value of life?
So I think it goes back to the comment.
Sorry, I had it loud. Sorry.
So what Jenny asked is, if I'm rephrasing this correctly, the Jewish text that Jack just quoted related to pain, so that if a person has pain, then they qualify. And the question that she posed is, what if the person doesn't have pain, and they're Jewish, and I'm a Jewish doctor, can I still offer them the treatment from a Jewish standpoint? So I think, Jack mentioned this earlier, this idea of total pain. So it's not just the physical pain, like, wow, I'm hurting physically because I have cancer in my bones, but I am hurting emotionally. And so I think that's where you can get, where you want to finesse it. I think there's, and suffering and pain, are they really the same thing? I would argue that the answer is yes. It's using words to describe a feeling. So I think the answer, I think that any of my patients who approach me requesting, and now I have my rabbinical approval, yeah, I think that would work because, again, defining pain, it's not just, oh, you have pain and therefore you take a pain medication. But if I'm suffering so much, and I kind of use the example of loss of control, I feel a lot of my patients who do ultimately pursue this form of treatment are typically people who had control in their life. And this idea of losing control is what they find very difficult, and they're suffering. So again, suffering and pain, I see those really as interchangeable words to describe a bad feeling.
I don't have too much to add to that. I think one of the things that I found interesting when you pointed out sort of differences between the responsum and New Mexico is they don't have the 6-month criterion in there. And I think that's actually maybe as substantive as the pain issue. Certainly some of the writings that I came across are worried about what they call the slippery slope. And you can imagine what that is, right? And other things, frankly, to push back on this issue about control. We don't have control over every aspect of our lives when we're in perfect health either, right? And so there's obviously some nuance to this. But I think Joel is right, that this issue about total pain is part of what was being addressed there.
There's a question back. Yes, so I'll repeat the question. So the question was really, how do we solve this problem with people who don't have capacity, have dementia? And, I know I want to do this today. I'm young, I'm healthy, I also have family history. I will want to do this. I don't want to do it now, but when I have dementia, when I don't, I want to then be able to qualify. So the law is very clear. So again, the law, you do not qualify because you have to, at the time of ingestion, you have to have capacity. So as a physician and as an end-of-life physician who does a lot of this kind of work, there are some things that we can do, and I do think it's very important, first and foremost, and I will take this opportunity to get on my soapbox, is talk to your family about your wishes. Talk to your family about your wishes in general, about, do you want to be on a ventilator? Under what circumstances? I mean, you'll never be able to describe all the situations that you will, but express your wishes to your children, to your spouses, to your loved ones, to your best friend, designate a medical power of attorney. So those are important things to have, because when you have lack of capacity, you're no longer able to make decisions for yourself. You want to make sure that it's not me making your decisions, because I don't know you. You want somebody who knows you and that you've had a chance to have these conversations with them. So I'll get it back off my soapbox. But there are some things we can do, and I will put a shout out to my good colleague, Jenny Kaufman, who's a great lawyer, and we work very closely with her for patients who I have a patient right now who has early dementia, so still has capacity. He's very, very clear about his wishes. He doesn't want to be a burden to his wife. And there are some things within the law. He does not qualify for medical aid in dying, but there's some things legally that he can do, and expressing his wishes very, very clearly, and ultimately allowing him to die relatively quickly and not kind of lingering this horrible years of kind of debility that people have towards the end of life with dementia. So no, you don't qualify for medical aid in dying, but yes, there are other options, and I'll just use the term we call VSED, or voluntary stopping eating and drinking. Happy to have a whole other talk about that some other time, but that's really the solution. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a neuropsychologist by training, and there is at least one country in Europe recognizing that as we have this aging society, more people are going to get different forms of dementia. If a person is diagnosed with dementia, they still have decisional capacity, handing it over to a trusted relative or friend to decide when the dementia is gone to the point where they would wish to be, end of life. The problem with dementia is there's good days and bad days. So it's not like there's a steady slope downward by which you say, okay, enough cognitive function is gone, life is no longer living. So that's going to be a very gray area. But I've got to say, having seen various forms of dementia, seeing what it's like for folks to live in these nursing homes, where in very bad circumstances at home, where they're not really being cared for very well. Yeah, for more people, if they get that diagnosis, they're not going to want to go to the
So I'll try to repeat that. Thank you. That's a great comment. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. So tell me your name. Your name? Bianca. So Bianca's comment was that, first of all, there are some countries in Europe that allow one to designate another person to then pursue medical aid in dying or some form. And the answer is you're correct. They also allow injection. That is Switzerland and Belgium. There was actually what?
The Netherlands.
I don't believe Netherlands. I think as far as I know, the only two countries right now in Europe that legal medical aid in dying and assigning somebody. And the difference is here you have to have capacity and you have to have a terminal diagnosis on the day. There is I can write up. I will get a terminal diagnosis. So I have dementia. It's early enough. And there's a great book, and it was actually a really nice review in the New York Times about maybe 8 or 9 months ago, about a woman who took her husband, and he was developing dementia, and he did pursue treatment, and I believe it was Switzerland. But I believe the only two countries, and again, this is a moving target. I mean, I think in the next 2 months, New York will come online, for example, which right now is not legal in New York, if you can believe it. So that was comment number one. And the other comment is just the challenge of a person with dementia it's very variable. It's not a linear process. People can have good days and bad days. And I agree, and that's, as I illustrated my story earlier, on the day of, and one thing I will say is when I am following a family or a particular individual in this process, I give them ample opportunity to change their mind, right? So if a person says to me, I really want to do this on June 20th, and I show up on June 20th, and they say, you know what? I don't want to do this today. And I will ask, as part of my evaluation on the day, we can wait because this treatment is the only treatment that I'm familiar with that is 100% effective. So if you are not 100% sure and you want to wait 2 more days, and I will share a little anecdote. I had a patient who lived here alone. His family was from all over the world. One of the cool things about this is that he was able to tell his family, I'm going to die on this day. And they all showed up 4 days later. And he was having a blast. And I showed up on the allotted day, and he says, Doc, I'm not ready. I'm having too much fun. And we waited 4 more days. They all left, and then he did the ingestion. So he got more time. And that's completely okay. I will come as many times as the person wants me to come, because on the day, once they have, I would say you can change your mind up until drinking the cocktail. Once you drink the cocktail, there's no turning back. There's no antidote. So yes, this is a fluctuating, both the decision, patients their mental capacity can change, they're not quite ready, they're scared, and so on that day, all of these things have to align perfectly, at least by New Mexico law. So again, the person has to have capacity, and they have to have a terminal diagnosis. So if for some reason, by miracle, they are cured of whatever the ailment is, they don't qualify. So hopefully that answers.
Before you go, Len, let me just mention that I feel some obligation to share with you that what we're talking about is specific to New Mexico when I'm speaking about Jewish practice, if you will. Joel trained in Israel, and Israel, as you know, and there's a lot of tension over this right now, Israel is dominated by the more conservative text tradition, if you will, on issues like this. And these issues are completely not okay in Israel, including, and the reason I wanted to add this, is the issue about ventilators and all that. It's quite different in Israel. Things are much more rigid, if you will, and so there is no medical assistance in dying in Israel. There's no removing the ventilator. All those things are following the very early rigid texts, if you will, and continuing to subscribe to those for better or worse, I will say.
So healthcare power of attorney gives a person certain medical rights, significant amount of medical. Well, I'm doing my best. It gives the healthcare power of attorney transfers a lot of patients' rights to a third party who has the right to make those decisions. But it sounds like in this case, there's a conflict between the two, that it's not sufficient for those person who has the power of attorney who can make decisions that in principle would end someone's life, but they can't do it in this case.
That's correct, yeah. So the law is very clear in New Mexico that the person, him or herself, has to have capacity, and it is not something that at the moment, interestingly, New Mexico has the most liberal law in the country, none of the 11 jurisdictions around the country allow for somebody else to make that decision, and we can understand. It's amazing that it's actually ever passed. I have to say, right? The fact that we're a Catholic state, there are not that many, so the fact that this did pass and we are way ahead of the game. We have right now New York and Massachusetts, I believe, are working on trying to pass these laws in their legislature right now, and they're using the New Mexico law as their template, not the Oregon law, which has been legal since 1994. Right? In Oregon, you have to wait 14 days. Here, it's only 48 hours, and the doctor can just waive it with basic, that seems okay. We'll just waive it. And we do that, I would say, relatively regularly. Sir.
Yeah, on that point, can you hear me? Okay. Because it just occurred to me, if it's a new law in New Mexico, then the lawyers are going to have to come up with new wills to compensate for these right to die legislations, right? Or am I off base on that? In other words, if I have a power of attorney, really? Okay. Yeah, if I have something in my will that gives, let's say, my spouse power of attorney over me, is that adequate under this new law? Or do we need to go visit an attorney to get a new will drawn up? And I'm sure everybody has a similar question like that. That's the question. Do we need new wills?
So the answer is no, again, because the will, and I'm not a lawyer, serves two purposes. What happens to all your stuff after you die, and what happens to you before you die and when you can't make decisions for yourself. The law is very clear. You have to be the one making decisions. So nobody, if you can't make decisions for yourself, that's an automatic disqualifier. You do not qualify. And we cannot pursue medical aid in dying. So no, I don't believe you need a new will. But is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question probably that neither you nor the rabbi can answer, Joel, and that is that what, from a legal perspective on insurance, let's say that you have a life insurance policy. Where do you stand on that one?
So that's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. So it's very important that this, as I said earlier, this is not suicide. So your death certificate will say what your cause of death. So congestive heart failure, pancreatic cancer. So nobody but me and the patient know that this happened. This is a medical treatment. Interestingly, in New Mexico, you do not have to be a physician. We're the only state that does not require an MD to be the prescribing medication. We have to certify, so an MD has to certify that the patient has capacity, but does not need to, it can be a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant. And no place anywhere does it say that this patient died using medical aid in dying. They died by their fill in the blank, whatever their underlying condition. So yes, as far as life insurance, there should not be an issue. I think this. Oh.
I think I'm just thinking of another situation other than a terminal illness where an assisted death might make sense, which is just like an injury. Like what if there's like a car crash or someone's in like a military situation and it leaves the person in a situation where they're just like so suffering, and it's not a terminal illness situation at all, but it still could make a lot of sense to end their suffering. Is that something that like comes up as well?
So plenty of my patients suffer, and I'll give you just an example.
This is when they get the bill.
That too. No, no. So you have to have qualify for hospice, number one, and you have to have a life expectancy of 6 months or less. So if you were involved in a car crash, or a person was involved in a car crash, and they are suffering tremendously and they have chronic pain, so one option is to stop treatment of whatever they're under. I use dialysis as a great example. So patients who are receiving some form of life-sustaining treatment, as long as they're on dialysis, they're not terminal. The second they decide, I'm not going to continue dialysis treatment, now they're terminal, and they would qualify. So we work with our patients. I mean, part of my job as a physician, I joke about, on the day of, really, I'm just there as a bartender, but really most of the work happens beforehand of trying to see, make sure that they are really, this is what they want to do, and are there other alternatives? Do they understand their alternatives, and do they really qualify? And then we follow them during that process. So the answer is, your scenario, the answer would be no, unless they were able to withdraw some sort of treatment that was keeping them alive. I use pacemaker as another example. You have a person who has a pacemaker, and they decide that's it, they want to die. We can say we can turn the pacemaker off because that is life-sustaining treatment that they want to stop. And then once the pacemaker has been turned off, then they would qualify because that's been keeping them alive. So that, yes, that hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you both so much for engaging this conversation. I'm just curious, Joel, are you the solo determiner of the situation, or do you need a second physician to acknowledge your diagnosis of the 6 month and all that?
So, again, according to New Mexico law, you need two people, two physicians, to determine that the person does have a medical or a terminal diagnosis and a life expectancy of 6 months or less. And I'm trying to. So in many states, you actually have to have this certified in a very, very complicated way, and you have to have the first request, and there's a second request, and then two different physicians, and it's a very arduous, very painful process in all states at this point, except for I think it's New Mexico. We by far has, and Barrett can probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but so here you have to have one physician. You have to have the request, and then the request to me is as the prescriber, and I prescribe the medication. There has to be another physician, and I'm not sure exactly what the wording is, but they have to certify. And the way we work around it, if they qualify for hospice, then we have another physician who qualified for hospice, and that's good enough. So we require all of our patients to be on hospice. If they're not on hospice when we first meet them, we enroll them in hospice. So the law does require two medical providers to agree that they have a terminal diagnosis. I think that's the sticky part, really. And to qualify for that, we use hospice and then one of us. Barrick, you want to?
Yeah, I have the mic.
Well, not so much illegal, but all of it. Basically, I'm Barrick Wolf, and I'm currently chair of the board of this nonprofit organization, End of Life Options New Mexico, that works with all the clinicians, works with the public broadly to facilitate people's understanding as well as access to not only medical aid in dying, but whatever they need for end of life. But just to clarify, this is not sort of a workaround in terms of hospice. This is actually envisioned in our law, and we're the only state that had this, which is why we've been able to facilitate so much more access to aid in dying, because most people are going to get to hospice first, and then that counts for the 6-month prognosis, and our law recognized that. So if you're in hospice, you really only need one additional clinician to go ahead and go through the whole qualification process. So yeah, we're doing it just fine.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond about what you were saying about the pacemaker. So it's my understanding that's it's not cut and dry in Jewish law. Once a treatment is started, it's not it's not clear that we can remove that treatment under Jewish law. So if someone is on a ventilator or on a feeding tube or has a pacemaker or has some other thing, I'm not talking about from a medical perspective or from a legal perspective. From a Jewish perspective, it's not such an easy out to say we just stop that. So I think it's important for people to understand that that is the case under Jewish law. I have to say personally, I'm rather disturbed by the story about the person, and when their family came in, they were very excited for 4 more days, and I'm wondering whether, I think that's wonderful, and maybe the issue is not that the person is suffering, but maybe the issue is that if we're concentrating on our suffering, then life is not very fun. And when we have family around or community around, maybe there's a whole different issue that we're just avoiding here. Which is how we live life in this Western society. I find that story particularly disturbing because good days and bad days, well, on our good days, life is great. And on our not so good days, well, everyone has not so good days. So I just, I guess, and the same thing with the story about not being in control. That seems to me that's a very kind of Western contemporary idea. And the truth is that in other points in history, perhaps people were more aware that, frankly, we are never in control of what's going on, and that everything, all of our talents and skills are something that are bequeathed to us from God, and we're not really in control. And every person has certain times in our lives when we're just not in control. You know, someone else around us does something, or something happens, or a pandemic comes, we're just not in control. So to say that that is a reason to allow someone to die, and I guess my question would be, I would really like to go into the weeds a little bit, and why the physicians are very committed not to call this suicide, because obviously there is a negativity around suicide, and why is there so much of insistence of calling this medical aid in dying, and what does that mean? Where is the difference, and where do you see the difference in that? If someone's deciding to die, how is it different if it's medically assisted, where if it's a suicide? I guess I would like to flesh that out a little bit.
I'll let Jack answer the first
Yeah, I want
part.
to do the first
I
one.
can't answer
Right.
that part at all.
Yeah, so, and I alluded to this when I was talking about the situation in Israel, that there is from, say, the more traditional Jewish texts, there is a pretty clear difficulty with removing treatments. And that has led to the situation in Israel where you can't just pull somebody off of a ventilator once they've been put on that. And the same would apply to the pacemaker that you mentioned as well. That's the situation in what I would call the more orthodox world, if you will, and the texts would support that. I think there's arguments that can be made that I have heard. I had a conversation one-on-one with Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who's the author of this book about issues in life and death, who's a conservative rabbi. So this is, it's not orthodox, but it's not very, progressive, if you will, from a reform perspective. And what Rabbi Dorff said to me is, and I can't remember the analog exactly, so I'll tell you one, and it may not be so good, but if we prescribed eyeglasses for somebody to correct a vision problem, and it just didn't work, and these are not fixing their vision, we don't make them continue to wear those glasses for the rest of their life, right? We remove the glasses because that treatment didn't fix the problem. And that's kind of the way I think he was addressing this issue about stopping treatment, because treatments are supposed to fix a problem. They're not supposed to delay, something without really addressing the core problem. So that was what he shared with me one-on-one, and I thought that was a very useful perspective. And I'll flip it over to you.
So just one more comment about that. I mean, in medical ethics, there's this idea of futility. So if a treatment isn't, kind of going to the same idea, I mean, if a treatment isn't making a difference, it's actually ethically appropriate to stop that treatment. So I think that's kind of, again, that's not Jewish ethics, that's just general ethics. So that's kind of my approach to these things. If if this is just keeping you alive, but you're not, your quality of life, and again, these are all very vague and hard to quantify. And I think, your question is excellent. I mean, yes, I struggle with some of these situations because when I meet many of my patients for the first time, they're very, very clear. I want to do this. But we all know that this is a big decision. And so I make it very, very clear in my counseling and when I meet with the patient, with the family, that it is okay to change your mind. And, the choosing of the date sometimes is a little arbitrary. So when I say, I want to do this on next Thursday, why next Thursday? Why not next Friday? So part of my response to that, if one decides to change their mind and wait a few days, because, they're having a good day. There's nothing wrong with that. Enjoy that extra few days because it doesn't change the bottom line. That person does have a terminal diagnosis. They are going to die probably a pretty miserable death. And my biggest fear is what often happens is people get very, very scared and they end up going to the hospital at the end, and that's where they die. And I've seen that much too much in my career, in my hospital life. And I believe that most people will say, if I ask you, where do you want to take your last breath? it's going to be at home with, surrounded by my loved ones, rather than in a hospital surrounded by a bunch of doctors in the middle of the night who don't even know me. So we allow that to happen. Regarding your question of suicide, again, I mean, as Jack kind of pointed out, we're all dying at some level or other. So, you know, the law defines 6 months as, you know, if you are thought to live, to die within the next 6 months, and I will be completely frank, doctors are terrible at predicting the time of death. I mean, even my patients who I have ingested the medication, and I, in my mind, like, okay, this is going to be pretty quick, I am often wrong. So it's, you know, I think, oh, this person, he's on 10 liters of oxygen, he's very, very old, he hasn't been on a bed in months, and I think they're going to die within 10, 20 minutes, and that's the person who dies after an hour and a half, versus the person who's like, wow, he's pretty robust, and, you know, he has a strong heart, he's actually, they're young, but they just have this, and then they die because they die quickly. So we're terrible at predicting. But the best we can, if a person has a terminal diagnosis, and again, blindness doesn't qualify. I had a 93-year-old woman a few months ago say to me, Dr. Rosen, I'm 93, I'm going blind. When I go totally blind, I want to be able to take the cocktail. And I said, you won't qualify, right? So blindness isn't a terminal diagnosis. Luckily for her, she developed pneumonia a short while after that. And at that point, she did qualify because she refused treatment. So we try to help people in this process as best we can, but all within the law.
Have you had experience of the client being completely ready and fulfilling all the requirements, but a family member being absolutely against it, and they're there with the person who's ready?
So yes, I have had one situation. It was a woman who had 2 young sons, and they weren't ready. It was interesting. They said to her, "We support you," and she refused. She was in her 90s. She had multiple medical conditions, and she was in the hospital. She was miserable in the hospital, and she said, "Just discharge me, and I'm going to go home in hospice, and I want to die." And that's when I was called. And the sons were very upset because her treatment, her condition was reversible. She had treatment that we could treat with a relatively easy treatment. She probably could have gone on to live for a few more years. And she's like, "Look, all my friends have died. I live in one of the nursing facilities here in town. My life isn't really worth living." So they were a little upset. And I will say that this was when the law was relatively new, and I was a little bit worried. And I did ultimately want the sons to kind of give their blessing. And I did. I actually came every single day. Even though she qualified, there was no question. I waited, and we talked to the sons, and we kind of negotiated a kind of a modified treatment. We'll just try something for a little bit. Just to tell you the anecdote, this particular situation, the son, she had a kidney condition, and the son happened to be a researcher in his field of this. He knew more about this than I did, and he really wanted this new treatment that he was developing to be available to her. And I said, let's give it 3 days, knowing that it's not going to change anything. And she was actually very upset with him. But it's always very uncomfortable when you have conflict in the situation. So, but I've definitely had patients who said, "Please, no, but nobody can know. I don't want my children to know about this." And that's totally fine but when they're there, it's tricky. And that was the one situation. And I felt a little bit like, wow, he's trying to push. But they wanted their mother to stay around. They were relatively young. They were about, so so yes, that has happened.
If I could, on this same point, the legal underpinning for all that we're talking about here in New Mexico and really nationally is the Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act, which was passed in 1995 or so here in New Mexico. We were one of the first states. And it really is what authorizes us to make our own healthcare decisions for ourselves, life and death decisions. It also empowers us and gives us the legal right to appoint a surrogate who can make some of these decisions for us, but as you've discussed, not all of them when you have to have capacity right at the end. So it's uncomfortable and difficult at times when the family members aren't really supporting what the client or the patient wants. And I love it that you sort of tried to help that situation. That's marvelous. But it really is up to each of us to do this homework, to figure out our own approach and what we want to have, a good quality of life at the end of life. And I think that's what, it's just an option. Nobody has to do anything under this law. No clinician, no pharmacist, no social worker, no patient. It's totally voluntary for everybody involved. And that's what makes it, I think, so powerful.
Well, I just wanted to say that I had the same response as Beverly did about the patient who didn't necessarily have to die. So this story is also cringy to me when you say this woman who was 93 could have had a relatively simple treatment and continued to live for a few years. But I remember thinking about this when I heard about the story at the time, and the fact is I believe those two sons who wanted their mother to live so much didn't live in Santa Fe. And they weren't going to move to Santa Fe and live near their mother and give her the satisfaction of daily life that she was lacking. And I mean, this may be a very far stretch for many of you, but I feel the same way about abortion. I feel that it would be one thing if we were all going to jump in and take care of the babies that women feel they can't financially, psychologically, et cetera, take care of. So I think these are very broad social issues. And as Beverly said, we in Western society don't take care of our elderly. So this is a case that's going to occur again and again unless we have a very supportive social network around our aging people so that they want to live despite pain.
Thanks very much. And I just wanted to add that I think Judaism is not a Western religion. I mean, it's not a Western tradition. And I think for that reason, there's the network of the community and the society that's very central to the rabbinic texts. It's not like what we're used to in this country of very individual rights. It's much more of a society, community type thing. And so Judaism, by its very nature, is going to have this tension because it's applied now to a society where we're used to individuals having lots of self-control, if you will, but the texts are really thinking of a different kind of society. And abortion it's the same kind of topic. It's not black and white. It's not true that Jewish texts support a woman's right to choose. That's not really an accurate statement. It certainly recognizes that there are situations where abortion is a sad but appropriate response. But it's not like, whatever you want, you're an individual, make your own decisions. That's not consistent with Jewish text.
I initially had one comment, but first I would like to make a comment about this particular issue, and that involves our healthcare system as well as our community. And it involves a couple of nursing home patients that I had who were both terminal and were just hanging on, and they wanted to go. And one of them, I was able to arrange for her to have services on Zoom from a synagogue in Dallas, and she was able to resolve her relationship with Hashem, and then I got her sister to come into the nursing home, and she resolved her relationship with her sister. And after those two things were resolved, she passed peacefully in 3 days. And I had another patient, same situation, and was able to have a conversation with his wife and his daughter about telling him that it was okay. And that one, all three of us were standing there when they told him that it was okay for him to go, and it only took him 5 minutes. So, sometimes it isn't necessary to use the medication if we find out what's holding them here.
So thanks for that story, because that reminds me of a patient that I was taking care of a few months ago, and she had terminal ovarian cancer, and it was in her 70s, and it was very, very clear to me when I met her, I don't intend to take the medication. I had two, in her words, I had 2 natural births. I intend to have a natural death. But I'm so afraid of what is going to happen that I want to have this as an option. And so we had the medications there. We talked every single day. She ultimately died within a week or two of when I first met her. So yes, I mean, kind of going to what Barak was saying, even having the medications at home doesn't require you to take them. I mean, some people just like having that as an option. She knew she was going to die. She wanted to do it, but she just was, death is scary. And she just wanted to have this as an option because she knew that if it gets too hard, she has a way to get out quicker. So that definitely is something that I take very seriously, and I tell patients, by meeting me, by ordering the medication, at no time does it require you to take the medication. It's just there for you, and we probably had, I think maybe 10% of our patients who have enrolled in medical aid dying don't end up taking it. Either they choose a date and then end up dying before then, or just want to have it there as an option. So it's just an option for some.
I didn't share with you something that I should have from that responsum from last year from the Reform movement. But one of the points that it makes is that in the time that most of these rabbinic texts were written, when people were at the end of life, it was a few days or a week, or in a terrible situation, 2 weeks. So in their time, not only did people not die from the diseases that we are generally dying from, but when they were at the end of life, it was a relatively quick process. And people would talk about, you had a week and you tied up your affairs and then you died. So that's maybe that was the context piece that I failed to put in there. I want to mention, we went to a program recently and nobody could leave because everybody was trying to be polite, and it just seemed like it was going on and on. We're almost at the 90-minute point, so I wanted to make sure to thank Devin for arranging everything for this session today, so thank you, Devin. And I wanted to thank Dr. Rosen for stimulating the idea of putting something like this together, which doesn't mean this is the last time we can do this, because I still have more books on my shelves. So, but I wanted to thank you all also for your engagement. And I would say, if you want to leave, I mean, we're not in a rush to leave, but if you want to leave, I don't want you to feel trapped like we did the other day.
Wherever you went for a good time, Ria
Thank you. We'll allow maybe 2 more questions, so.
I have friends in the disability movement who, you mentioned slippery slope. They're concerned that this is a slippery slope in that New Mexico is doing that this year. We'll all get used to it. 20 years from now, the wording may change in the law, and it might be a little easier to say that person is finished instead of them saying it. Do you see any concerns there? I don't believe it myself, but some people are rabidly concerned that this slippery slope is going to happen.
I would say probably the opposite is more likely. I think that, especially where, I don't know, I want to say this country, Israel, and many other countries, I think we're getting more and more conservative, and this is definitely something that, we live in a very Christian country and very much very conservative Christian country, and, again, I don't know what the elections are going to be in 2 years, but we know with the Supreme Court, at this point, it's probably not at risk because this is a state thing rather than a federal thing. But I would say we're more likely to have this law be withered down, and we saw this with abortion, of course. So I think that is less likely to be the case, but I don't know.
One of the reasons I came today is because about a year ago, my brother took his life. He was 90. He was in a great deal of pain. But I felt that, I saw how his family was so pained by this happening. They had no preparation for it. He hadn't talked to anyone about it. And I think that's the other side of it, and we don't really see that much. But if he could legally have done this, he was in Wisconsin, it would have been so nice for him, I think, to have that support, and for so much easier on his family. And I don't think we've really looked at that.
So I've had, I'll say this and hopefully nobody's from the authorities are listening, but one of the requirements is you have to be a New Mexico resident. It doesn't define what that means. Interestingly, in Vermont, they just readjusted the law that you do not need to be a Vermont resident. But yes, we get some medical tourists, I call them, who come here, and I have one woman in particular who's from out of state, and basically she was going to commit suicide with a gun, and the husband kind of convinced her that was kind of the deal. We're going to move to New Mexico, and we'll find this treatment for you, because they were from Texas, and she did pursue, and she did this for her husband's sake. She was very, not the word happy, but very much committed to pursuing ending her life violently, so yes, so that is. And I will also share, that we know that before the law passed, and I've heard this numerous times by patients, is when you're on hospice, you have a relatively unlimited access to various medications, and people stockpile, and then they just take them all. The problem is it doesn't always work. As I say this, tongue in cheek, but this treatment, and I stand on shoulders of giants who have come up with this cocktail, because this is not my combination, but it is 100% effective. The only thing we don't know is how long from when the person goes to sleep until they die, but it's no more than a day, and that is very much an outlier. We track every single death that occurs around the country in the 11 jurisdictions, and we know that the average right now is about 45 minutes. So this is not a long, and there's no blood squirting anywhere. It's a very gentle. It is, the term I use, it is a good death. And there was another question, and we can wrap it up. You had another question? No. Will be our last question.
One of the problems that I have had with my chronic pain patients is many chronic pain patients are not terminal. But in the current healthcare situation with the government and the DEA and the insurance companies, it is very difficult for them to receive proper pain control. And so they can be in extreme pain for years. And I'm wondering what we can do about that. It probably is more related to getting them the proper pain control. And I have no idea how to do that.
You're opening up a can of worms. I mean,
I know.
my medical practice that is part of, is only medical aid dying is a small part of, is trying to answer that question. Because yes, healthcare in the United States was falling apart and COVID just, killed it. It's a disaster. And in a state like ours where there's a huge physician shortage, it's a serious problem. So they just need good medical care. With good medical care, they should get their pain under control. Mm-hmm. So that's, but doctors need to have time. They need to have a system to get paid. I have a small solution for my patient population. There's 2 of us, and we're trying to make a difference in a very unusual way.
Yeah.
But yes, it's a mess. Don't get sick, and don't have pain. Well, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
Can I say a word? Thank you, Rabbi and Doctor, for putting this on. It was lovely.